In the Hebrew Bible, the Urim and Thummim are associated with the Hoshan, divination in general, and cleromancy in particular. Most scholars suspect that the phrase refers to specific objects involved in the divination. Name and meaning. Thummim is widely considered to be derived from the consonantal root, meaning innocent, while Urim has traditionally been taken to derive from a root meaning lights. These derivations are reflected in the Nekadot of the Masoretic text. In consequence, Urim and Thummim has traditionally been translated as lights and perfections, or, by taking the phrase allegorically, as meaning revelation and truth, or doctrine and truth. Although at face value the words are plural, the context suggests they are pluralized intensivus, singular words which are pluralized to enhance their apparent majesty. The singular forms, and tum, have been connected by some early scholars with the Babylonian terms urtu and tamachu, meaning oracle and command, respectively. Many scholars now believe that simply derives from the Hebrew term, meaning curses, and thus that Urim and Thummim essentially means cursed or faultless, in reference to the deity's judgment of an accused person. In other words, Urim and Thummim were used to answer the question innocent or guilty. Form and function. 1 Samuel chapter 14 verse 41 is regarded by biblical scholars as key to understanding the Urim and Thummim. The passage describes an attempt to identify a sinner, via divination, by repeatedly splitting the people into two groups and identifying which group contains the sinner. In the version of this passage in the Masoretic text, it describes Saul and Jonathan being separated from the rest of the people, and lots being cast between them. The Septuagint version, however, states that Urim would indicate Saul and Jonathan, while Thummim would indicate the people. In the Septuagint, a previous verse uses a phrase which is usually translated as "Inquired of God," which is significant as the grammatical form of the Hebrew implies that the inquiry was performed by objects being manipulated. Scholars view it as evident from these verses and versions that cleromancy was involved, and that Urim and Thummim were the names of the objects being cast. The description of the clothing of the Hebrew high priest in the book of Exodus portrays the Urim and Thummim as being put into the sacred breastplate worn by the high priest over the ephod, where the biblical text elsewhere describes an ephod being used for divination. Scholars presume that it is referring to use of the Urim and Thummim in conjunction with the ephod, as this seems to be intimately connected with it. Similarly, where non-prophets are portrayed as asking Hashem for guidance, and the advice isn't described as given by visions, scholars think that Urim and Thummim were the medium implied. In all but two cases, the question is one which is effectively answered by a simple yes or no. A number of scholars believe that the two exceptions to this pattern, which give more complex answers, were originally also just sequences of yes/no questions, but became corrupted by later editing. There is no description of the form of the Urim and Thummim in the passage describing the high priest's vestments, and a number of scholars believe that the author of the passage, which textual scholars attribute to the priestly source, wasn't actually entirely aware of what they were either. Nevertheless, the passage does describe them as being put into the breastplate, which scholars think implies they were objects put into some sort of pouch within it, and then, while out of view, one was chosen by touch and withdrawn or thrown out. Since the Urim and Thummim were put inside this pouch, they were presumably small and fairly flat, and were possibly tablets of wood or of bone. Considering the scholars' conclusion that Urim essentially means guilty and Thummim essentially means innocent, this would imply that the purpose of the Urim and Thummim was an ordeal to confirm or deny suspected guilt. If the Urim was selected, it meant guilt, while selection of the Thummim would mean innocence. According to classical rabbinical literature, in order for the Urim and Thummim to give an answer, it was first necessary for the individual to stand facing the fully dressed high priest, and vocalize the question briefly and in a simple way, though it wasn't necessary for it to be loud enough for anyone else to hear it. The Talmudist rabbis argued that Urim and Thummim were words written on the sacred breastplate. Most of the Talmudist rabbis, and Josephus, following the belief that Urim meant light, argued that divination by Urim and Thummim involved questions being answered by great rays of light shining out of certain jewels on the breastplate. Each jewel was taken to represent different letters, and the sequence of lighting thus would spell out an answer. Two Talmudist rabbis, however, argued that the jewels themselves moved in a way that made them stand out from the rest, or even moved themselves into groups to form words. According to Islamic sources, there was a similar form of divination among the Arabs before the beginning of Islam. There, two arrow shafts, on one of which was written command and the other prohibition or similar, were kept in a container, and stored in the Kaaba at Mecca. Whenever someone wished to know whether to get married, go on a journey, or to make some other similar decision, one of the Kaaba's guardians would randomly pull one of the arrow shafts out of the container, and the word written upon it was said to indicate the will of the god concerning the matter in question. Sometimes a third, blank, arrow shaft would be used, to represent the refusal of the deity to give an answer. This practice is called rabdomancy, after the Greek roots rhabd, rot, and mansi. History of use. A passage of the books of Samuel mentions three methods of divine communication: dreams, prophets, and the Urim and Thummim. The first two of these are also mentioned copiously in Assyrian and Babylonian literature, and such literature also mentions tablets of destiny, which are similar in some ways to the Urim and Thummim. The tablets of destiny had to rest on the breast of deities mediating between the other gods and mankind in order to function, while the Urim and Thummim had to rest within the breastplate of the priest mediating between God and mankind. Marduk was said to have put his seal on the tablets of destiny, while the Israelite breastplate had a jeweled stone upon it for each of the Israelite tribes, which may derive from the same principle. Like the Urim and Thummim, the tablets of destiny came into use when the fate of king and nation was concerned. According to some archaeologists, the Israelites emerged as a subculture from within Canaanite society, and not as an invading force from outside, and therefore it would be natural for them to have used similar religious practices to other Semitic nations. And these scholars suspect that the concept of Urim and Thummim was originally derived from the tablets of destiny. The first reference to Urim and Thummim in the Bible is the description in the book of Exodus concerning the high priest's vestments. The chronologically earliest passage mentioning them, according to textual scholars, is in the book of Hosea, where it is implied, by reference to the ephod, that the Urim and Thummim were fundamental elements in the popular form of the Israelite religion. In the mid-8th century BC, consulting the Urim and Thummim was said to be permitted for determining territorial boundaries, and was said to be required, in addition to permission from the king or a prophet, if there was an intention to expand Jerusalem or the temple in Jerusalem. However, these rabbinical sources did question, or at least tried to justify, why Urim and Thummim would be required when a prophet was also present. The classical rabbinical writers argued that the Urim and Thummim were only permitted to be consulted by very prominent figures such as army generals, the most senior of court figures, and kings, and the only questions which could be raised were those which were asked for the benefit of the people as a whole. Although Josephus argues that the Urim and Thummim continued to be used until the era of the Maccabees, Talmudist sources are unanimous in agreeing that the Urim and Thummim were lost much earlier, when Jerusalem was sacked by the Babylonians. In a passage from the part of the Book of Ezra which overlaps with the Book of Nehemiah, it is mentioned that individuals who were unable to prove, after the Babylonian captivity had ended, that they were descended from the priesthood before the captivity began, were required to wait until priests in possession of Urim and Thummim were discovered. This would appear to confirm the statements in the Talmud that the Urim and Thummim had by then been lost. Indeed, since the priestly source, which textual scholars date to a couple of centuries prior to the captivity, doesn't appear to know what the Urim and Thummim looked like, and there is no mention of the Urim and Thummim in the Deuteronomic history beyond the death of David. Scholars suspect that use of them decayed sometime before the Babylonian conquest, probably as a result of the growing influence of prophets at that time. Latter-day Saint movement. Joseph Smith, founder of the Latter-day Saint movement, said that he used interpreters in order to translate the Book of Mormon from the golden plates. The interpreters he described as a pair of stones, fastened to a breastplate joined in a form similar to that of a large pair of spectacles. Smith later referred to this object as the Urim and Thummim. In 1823, Smith said that the angel Moroni, who had told him about the golden plates, also told him about the Urim and Thummim, two stones in silver bows, fastened to a breastplate, and the angel intimated that they had been prepared by God to aid in the translation of the plates. Smith's mother, Lucy Mack Smith, described these Urim and Thummim as being like two smooth three-cornered diamonds. Smith also said he used the Urim and Thummim to assist him in receiving other divine revelations, including some of the sections of the Doctrine and Covenants and portions of the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible. Although many of Smith's associates said they saw him use the devices, only Oliver Cowdery seems to have attempted to use them to receive his own revelation. Latter-day Saints believed that Smith's Urim and Thummim were functionally identical to the biblical Urim and Thummim. There is no evidence that the latter were ever used to translate unknown texts. Smith extended the use of the term Urim and Thummim to describe the dwelling place of God, the earth in a future state, and the white stone mentioned in the Book of Revelation. In popular culture, in accordance with the belief that Urim and Thummim translates to light and truth, the Latin equivalent Lux Veritas has been used for several university mottos, though Urim and Thummim itself is emblazoned across the open book pictured on the Yale University coat of arms. Lux Veritas appears below on a banner. The Urim and Thummim are also afforded some value as artifacts in some modern fiction. Thomas Mann has elaborated greatly on the definition of this term in Joseph the Provider, the fourth book of his tetralogy, Joseph and His Brothers. A treasure hunt for the Urim and Thummim forms the central plot of the John Bellairs novel The Revenge of the Wizard's Ghost. Their apparent desecration by an unknown vandal is a theme in the Arthur Conan Doyle short story, The Jew's Breastplate. In the Christian fiction novel The Face of God, by Bill Myers, the pastor Daniel Lawson and terrorist Ibrahim El-Magidi race to find the Urim and Thummim, as well as the 12 stones of the sacred breastplate, in order to hear God's voice. In the novel The Alchemist, by Paulo Coelho, page 30, the King of Salem gives the main character Santiago 2 stones that the king calls Urim and Thummim. One of the stones is black, which is said to signify yes, and the other is white, said to signify no, a significance applicable when the stones are asked an appropriate question and drawn from a bag. The king himself had removed the stones from his shining golden breastplate. Urim and Thummim were the names given to two objects of mystical technology in the Prosopopia Transmedia series, culminating in the International Emmy Award-winning participatory drama series The Truth About Marika by SVT The Company P. In the television series Dig, the breastplate that is a part of the mystery is said to be the breastplate of the high priest of the temple in Jerusalem and used to communicate with God. The traditional rabbinical descriptions of the function of Urim and Thummim, transmitting messages by glowing, have been claimed by some proponents of Paleo contact hypothesis to be evidence in support of that hypothesis.